Good afternoon, everybody. I am calling the regular meeting of the Planning Commission to order for Thursday, June 21st, 2018. And Ms. Vaughn, would you take roll, please?
Thank you, Chair Wiscombe. Chair Wiscombe?
Here.
Vice Chair Lodge?
Here.
Commissioner Higgins?
Here.
Commissioner Jordan?
Here.
Commissioner Schwartz?
Here.
Commissioner Thompson?
Here.
Commissioner Campanella is absent. We have quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Vaughn. Okay, we'll move on to item number 2, preliminary matters. 2A, request for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or addition of ex-agenda items. Ms. Brooke?
Chair Wiscombe, I'm not aware of any of those.
Okay, and how about B, 2B, announcements and appeals?
No announcements or appeals today.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're moving on to 2C, which is review, consideration, and action on the following draft Planning Commission minutes and resolutions. And the minutes are from our June 7th, 2018 meeting with PC resolution number 017-18 for 5 Santa Cruz Boulevard. Pardon? Did you say something? Oh, okay. Okay, and I did request a couple of changes, and Ms. Vaughn made them, and I think the top minutes are they the red line ones? No, the bottom ones are the red line ones. Okay, so in what you had on your desk, the bottom ones were redlined, and the changes that I requested were first in the numbering, which was a little cattywampus, and second was the motion under number 1. This is on page 4 of 5. I believe the motion should have stated the report. This is in the first paragraph of number 1. The report shall be prepared following the rainy season and submitted to the Building and Safety Division honor before May 31st of each year. And then that condition was reworded again in the resolution if you need to look at that. So if those changes are acceptable, I would entertain a motion. Does anyone want these two separately? Or are we all right together?
Together.
Okay.
So I'll move both.
Okay.
Second?
Okay, and that's moving it as amended?
Yes.
Okay.
As presented today.
As presented today?
Second.
And, okay. So we have a motion, a second. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Abstain.
Okay, and Commissioner Higgins abstains. Okay, so that takes care of that. We're going to move on to item 2D. Which is comments from members of the public pertaining to items not on the agenda today. Is anyone here to speak on an item that's not on the agenda? Okay, seeing no one, I will close general public comment. And we're going to move on to item number 3, which is a continued item from March 1st, 2018. It's the Planning Commission reviews of and recommendations to City Council for drafts of the General Plan map amendments and Local Coastal Program amendment, including the June 5th, 2018 draft Coastal Land Use Plan and related local coastal plan materials. And we've had, just for the record, we've had 2 staff addendums to that, which you have in your packets. No. Okay. Ms. Brooke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll also note that those 2 addendums are also posted on the city's website as well. So they're available should any members of the public not previously see them there. So as you mentioned, we are here before the Planning Commission again to discuss the draft Coastal Land Use Plan, which includes an LCP amendment and a General Plan map amendment. I'll go through what I hope is a brief presentation, receive any public comment, and then turn it to the Commission to consider and hopefully forward a recommendation to City Council on the LCP amendment and General Plan map amendment. I do also want to take a moment to just note I'm giving the staff presentation. However, the staff here with me today are really the fire and and have done all the work leading up to this point. So I don't want to pass this moment without introducing Rosie Deisty, Melissa Hedrick, and Timmy Bolton, and Deborah Andaloro, who could not be here today, also has led this effort over these multiple years.
If I may interrupt for 1 minute, Ms. Brooke, Ms. Brooke will give the presentation, and then we'll open it up to public comment. So if anyone wants to speak on this matter, there's speaker slips in the back of the room. If you just kindly fill out one of those. This is agenda item number 3, and you can.
Just asking for definition.
You could.
You are the planning commission.
Correct. We're the planning commission, sir. They're the staff, sir. Yeah, staff, city staff, yes. Yeah, okay. I didn't know if perhaps you didn't know the procedures, which is why I interrupted. So if you do choose to speak, just fill out a speaker slip, give it to Ms. Brooke, and you'll have 2 minutes up here on the podium. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Certainly, fine. So by way of a quick background, our presentation to the Planning Commission on March 1st went into the background a bit more extensively, but I'll just, as a reminder, mention again the overarching goals of the Coastal Act of 1976 are primarily to maximize public access to the coast, to protect, enhance, and balance the use of coastal resources, and prioritize coastal-dependent and coastal-related uses. So as we're going through our LCP amendment, these are the overarching goals that we're keeping in mind, as the LCP amendment ultimately has to be found consistent with the Coastal Act. The Coastal Act requires local governments in the coastal zone to prepare a local coastal program. The city has an existing local coastal program. It's comprised of a land use plan, which was originally certified by the Coastal Commission in 1981. In that are the land use designations and the policies that guide development in the coastal zone. And then in 1986, the Coastal Commission certified our implementation plan, which is what many refer to as our zoning ordinance or any other ordinances or implementing guidelines that implement the overarching policies of the land use plan. The city decided several years ago that it was more than past its prime and ready to update our local coastal program. For many reasons. For one, as I mentioned, it was originally adopted in 1981, and while there have been amendments to it, we haven't had a complete, comprehensive update to our local coastal program. Things have changed since then. We needed to modernize the language. We've also since updated our general plan and updated our zoning ordinance, and those are not yet effective in the coastal zone until we go through the LCP, Local Coastal Program Amendment process. Also, there are emerging issues since 1981 that are not adequately addressed in our LCP, and so we're taking the opportunity to update those as well. So, as I mentioned, we were before the Planning Commission on March 1st of this year with a discussion of the draft local coastal program as it existed that day. And on that day, the Planning Commission did recommend to the City Council for adoption of the General Plan Map Amendment and the LCP Amendment with some changes to that document. We were then scheduled to go to the City Council for a hearing on the LCP on April 24th. However, prior to that council hearing, we determined that some mailed noticing for the LCP amendment did not adhere completely with the California Code of Regulations. And so we've circled back and have done that noticing properly for this hearing. So that is why we're back before you again today after having done that additional noticing. We also decided to take that time to address any comments that Planning Commission had on the prior draft document, as well as address comments that were further raised by our discussions with Coastal Commission staff, any public comment letters we've received, and any other internal staff edits that we felt were warranted prior to bringing it back to you. So we have been in extensive discussions and consultations with the Coastal Commission staff over the last 4 years to develop this LUP and the associated maps. This The original goal of the draft LUP was to carry forward many of the existing policies, so long as they remained relevant, but also adding some new policies to help clarify how we conduct development review for projects in the coastal zone and putting in writing interpretations and procedures that we use when reviewing projects against the policies. Also, as I mentioned, there are some emerging issue areas that we needed to address, in particular sea level rise. Briefly summarizing the LUP process to date, we had a local coastal program subcommittee that met, I believe, 8 times, as well as we had some individual meetings with certain members of the subcommittee. The subcommittee was made up of the Planning Commission, Harbor Commission, and Parks and Recreation Commission, particular members of those bodies, as well as a lot of intra and interdepartmental participation, as I mentioned, Coastal Commission consultation. And then we had all of the public review and comment and hearing before the Planning Commission, before you made your recommendation to City Council. That also added to the process to get us the draft document we have before you today. So, in summary, I'll briefly summarize the draft coastal LUP before you today. We have highlighted in your staff report in much more detail than I'll provide to you right now orally, but in your staff report details the revisions that were made to the document since you saw it on March 1st. And those were primarily in response to edits that you specifically requested, comments from Coastal Commission staff, more meetings and conversations we had with them since March. The largest number of edits to the document are in the public access and hazards section of the document. Also, further clarification that we felt was necessary in some policies, and then in response to public comment. In particular, revisions since March 1st, we focused a lot of our effort on clarifying policies that address reductions in buffers, whether it be creek, bluff top, or ESHA, environmentally sensitive habitat areas, on constrained lots. And those policies called out there address how to evaluate development on constrained lots if they can't meet those buffer areas that are required by the LCP. And then policy 5.1-69, location of bluff edge. That addresses the location of bluff edge to be used when reviewing projects. We've added detail to the exact criteria that should be used to determine if the bluff edge that's mapped on figure 5.1-2 is inaccurate at any specific property. We added some more detail there as to what an applicant or property owner would do if they want to propose a different line other than what is mapped on the figure. In terms of public review of both drafts of the LUP, this is reaching back to when we first released the public review draft in November. It was released for 60 days from November 11th to January 11th. We also did extensive noticing back then to alert the public that the review draft was available. We had an open house. We made presentations at commissions and committees. And then we also held presentations with certain stakeholders who requested more one-on-one time with staff to discuss particular issues. So that was all leading up to your hearing on March 1st. And then since March 1st, in preparing for this hearing, we released the June 5th draft land use plan. And as part of that, we had a display ad in the news press. We sent mailed notice to any member of the public who requested mailed notice, as well as particular agencies that we are required to notice by the government code. And we mailed notice to any owner of property with a proposed land use change on the LCP land use map. We've also done multiple e-bulletins to members of the public who've asked to be notified about any changes. We posted on Nextdoor, and we did the legal ad for this meeting. And so I do, with all of that noticing and having the draft materials available at not only our office, but the library, the city clerk, and the two of the Coastal Commission offices, we've only received one public comment letter, which was received this morning. So, and then whatever we might receive today. So, as was mentioned, staff released 2 addendum to the staff report, and so I'll briefly go over what the addenda cover. The first was released on June 18th, and in that we responded to any comment letters that we received after your last hearing, and we addressed the comments by topic. And also, I will note that we did have a cutoff date of June 18th in order to respond to any public comment received to be included in that addenda. So the comment letter we received today, we don't have written responses to that addenda. It was received too late to be able to do that. Also in that first addenda, we proposed some changes to certain policies that are in your June 5th draft coastal LUP. Specifically, policy 5.1-33 was amended to make it clearer that the only types of minor development allowed in coastal bluff edge development buffers are patios, lighting, fencing, and landscaping. This was always our intent, but a public comment letter highlighted for us the fact that that intent might not have been as clear until we made the proposed revision. Also, policy 5.1-37 with respect to Sea Ledge Lane was also amended to correct an unintentional mistake. The purpose of this policy is to address the parcels that are entirely located on the bluff face on Sea Ledge Lane. So this policy further limits future new development and substantial redevelopment on those particular lots to either the size of the existing residence or 1,200 square feet, whichever is larger. Previous versions of the policy also had limited a few other parcels that still contain a significant amount of land, landward of the coastal bluff top, and so those particular policies were omitted from being able to have this policy apply to it. So now we list specifically the assessor parcel numbers to which this policy applies. And then in the addendum that was released today, we made a couple other changes to policies. Specifically, policy 3.1-14 clarifies that mitigation may not always be required in order to not result in a significant increased use of any key public access parking area. As it was worded, it might have inferred that mitigation was always required if the city adopted a new parking program or amended parking requirements in order to not have an impact on those key public access parking areas. So we added language with or without mitigation. You must be able to comply to that comply with that policy. Also, there's several policies and a text edit in Chapter 4.1. Any policy that previously stated that you must install drought-tolerant landscaping were revised in situations where we're talking about wetlands or creek beds where drought-tolerant landscaping is not necessarily appropriate. And in fact, they inherently depend on water in those locations. Also, policy 4.3-8, changes there, we added the words, if feasible. This clarifies that impacts to visual resources may not always be entirely avoided by site selection and design alternatives alone, but if feasible, they should be pursued before any other methods are considered. And policy 5.1-38 addresses allowed landscaping and the amount and type of watering that's allowed for that landscaping on coastal bluff faces and coastal edge buffers. We needed additional clarity to distinguish that sprinkler systems, irrigation plumbing, and in-ground irrigation systems are not allowed on coastal bluff faces and coastal bluff edge development buffers. Manual watering would be allowed on the bluff face or slope failure areas only to the extent necessary to establish the plantings. and then watering would not be allowed after that. In the buffer area, manual water or drip irrigation is allowed, only, again, to the extent necessary for plant establishment and survival. And then on to the map amendments. So that covers the proposed revisions to the land use plan. And then with that, we also have the land use map and the general plan map amendments. So first, with respect to the general plan map amendments, this is a really minor map amendment, and it's really only in order to clearly distinguish that the land use designations for the inland areas of the city are shown on the general plan map. And so we will then have an accompanying local coastal program land use map that show the land use designations for the coastal zone. So that's really the extent of the general plan map amendment, is to just white out this area down here and say, see the LCP land use plan for those land use designations. So in addition to doing that on the LCP land use map amendment, we're also carrying forward those land use changes that were discussed and approved by City Council in 2011 as part of the general plan update. However, we never carried forward those land use designation changes as an LCP amendment to the Coastal Commission. So they have not been in effect in the coastal zone, and so we are proposing to carry those forward now, as well as making a couple other cleanup changes on certain parcels to better align the land use designations with existing development or surrounding land use designations or the underlying zoning. And this map was in your package, and it's also on our website. This highlights the areas where we're proposing land use designation changes on the LCP land use map. And I realize this is small, but we could dig in deeper if we wanted to talk about any one of these particular areas. And so this would be the resulting proposed local coastal program land use map, which was an exhibit to your staff report as well as a figure in the LCP. In terms of environmental review, local governments are exempt from CEQA when we are preparing and adopting an LCP. We, however, do also include a CEQA exemption, CEQA Guidelines Section 15061 for the general plan map amendment. As I mentioned, it's very minor and really just illustrative. So we've determined there's no possibility for significant effect on the environment by that illustration change. Even with those statutory and categorical exemptions, it is worth noting that the majority of those map amendments that we are proposing on the LCP land use plan were reviewed and within the scope of the general plan update and the general plan program EIR too. In terms of next steps, after Planning Commission hearings, should you make a positive recommendation to City Council for adoption, we are tentatively scheduled to be before them on August 7th. After that, if City Council does adopt the LCP amendment, then we would submit that to the Coastal Commission for certification. Also, we do have going on at the same time some future LCP amendments. Down here at the bottom, first, our sea level rise adaptation plan we're working on right now, as well as the lower costs overnight accommodation study. We anticipate, and the LCP anticipates, that we would have future amendments to the document as a result of those work efforts. We also have the intention at some point in the future making amendments to the implementation plan, which are the ordinances and guidelines that implement the policies, as well as at some point in the future amending our general plan to circle back with the new information and policy direction we're receiving on the LCP to the extent that some of those policy changes are relevant citywide and inland areas. Then we would want to go back and amend the general plan as well. So I'll conclude with staff's recommendation to the Planning Commission regarding the general plan map amendment and the LCP amendment. And that concludes our presentation. We are here available for any questions, should you have any.
Thank you, Ms. Brooke. Appreciate the presentation. I think we'll go to public comment. I believe Mr. Moldaver's here to speak, right? Welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Planning Commissioners, I'm Lee Moldaver, speaking at the request of the Coastal Resource Center, the Citizens Planning Association, and the Santa Barbara Audubon Society. And all three support the staff recommendation to adopt the LUP with the amendments as presented today. I'd like to preface my one substantive question with the observation that having been doing coastal-related stuff all the way back to when Dave Davis was drafting the 1981 plan with a weekend entire planning staff effort, and I was very privileged to be able to serve with Commissioner Schwartz's Bob on related efforts. I think this is one of the finest, broadest public outreach and education efforts for a local coastal plan anywhere in California. And so I really want to say thank you to all the staff, both those who are here and others who helped, who aren't, way beyond what was required. Also, the effort to really negotiate carefully but openly with the regional office of the California Coastal Commission, which is not, as you know, always easy. And a lot of their suggestions have worked their way in, some haven't. The one question that Audubon asked me to bring forward to you and to your staff is that Fish and Wildlife in their comments indicated that their map shows the need for environmentally sensitive habitat at East Beach to accommodate the western snowy plover. And we'd like to get in the record from Ms. Brooke, if she could, how the city in the final document is responding to that request from Fish and Wildlife, which Audubon also supports. That said, thank you for a great effort. Hope you adopt it, and of course, see you on Solstice.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else here to speak on the local coastal program update? Okay. Let the record state that I know Ms. Brooke already said it, but that we did receive, the Planning Commission is in receipt of a 21-page letter from Dahl and Associates dated June 20th, 2018 that I believe came into city staff today and was forwarded to the Planning Commission. So we're in receipt of that. So seeing no one else, we're closing public comment, and it's going to be back to the commission. We have Mr. Johnson here, Mr. Treiberg here, and they probably don't want to stay forever. So if commissioners maybe have any questions that they want to direct to them first, that would be really helpful, so they could go back to business. Does anyone have any questions for either specifically for Creeks or Harbor? Huh? No? Okay. Thank you very much for coming, and you're welcome to stay. I just, didn't want to have you. Okay. And so we're back to the commission for questions and comments. Commissioner Jordan.
Just have one really for staff, and that's how to handle the 21 pages from Dahl and Associates. I just got through 4 while Ms. Brooke was wandering through there, and the 4 pages I got through seemed to either be just grammar / text related, or just totally argumentative to the other side. So I'm just wondering, do we ignore it? Do we try and slug through it today? Do we just ask staff to respond to it appropriately after our hearing? What would be the game plan?
Madam Chair, Commissioner, so to the degree that we were able to closely look at the letter in the short time we had, the majority of the issues that are brought up have already been addressed either in the staff report topically or topically in the response to comment. They're all kind of variations on the same theme. There are a lot of comments about the public access requirements of the Coastal Act and how they're portrayed in the document. We have discussed those at length with the Coastal Commission. We've also incorporated all the Coastal Act policies as policies of the LCP into the document to cover any overarching issues that we haven't covered with our specific policies. So that covers a lot of his comments.
Is there anything in there that jumps out as an item of notice that you should talk about in front of us or not? That rises to the top of the list? Or I'm pretty happy with your explanation right there, but is there? I've only been 5 pages through it.
Yeah,
so.
not that I have noticed.
Okay.
Again, we didn't have time to come through the document, and I might ask Scott Vincent if he has anything to add. But from at least my perspective, most issues are either resolved by reading the document itself or the staff report.
Okay.
Madam Chair and Commissioner Jordan, I didn't see anything that the Commission needs to address itself. Their staff and I will continue to read the letter and respond as we think is appropriate. As there may be some minor changes to text. I don't see it changing the substance of any of the policies or recommendations, and there might be some clarification to some of the nomenclature that is used in figures and that kind of thing. Again, in a few places, just for example, since you've only read 4 pages, some of the figures describe the area, identify where the beach is on the figure so that persons reading the figure can understand and orient themselves. Mr. Dahl goes and takes that to a step where he interprets that labeling of the beach's location is actually a statement of legal determination that the beach is one thing or the other, either private property or public property or
Right.
other things. And so some of this stuff is very specific to his client's property.
His frame of reference.
And a frame of reference. That's true.
And then I guess one other question just says, I just always worry about potentially being on the other side of an argument with Mr. Moldaver. I recall there was some discussion sometime in the last year and a half on the snowy plover issue in East Beach, and I don't recall what the discussion was. But lingering, of course, in the back of my mind is I don't want a Vandenberg Air Base beach situation on a third of our city's coastline. So could you talk a little bit about what I can't remember and how you guys have worked through the snowy plover process?
Yes, Madam Chair, Commissioner Jordan. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service gave us a comment letter, I believe, prior to our previous March 1st hearing. And the nature of that comment letter was just that they wanted us to map the critical habitat areas of the western snowy plover that are in the city, which include foraging area and overwintering habitat. We don't currently have nesting habitat on our beaches. We had one occurrence of nesting on the Sandspit many years ago, but that has not repeated itself. And the nature of that letter was a little bit unclear about sensitive habitat, and so staff actually did follow up with U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff about their intention of the letter, and they did clarify that they are not intending the entire critical habitat area to be designated ESHA. That was not the intent of their letter. If we did find nesting there, that would maybe be the appropriate time to designate the beach as ESHA, but that they are mostly just concerned about management measures and things that might disturb the birds. And so what you have in your document now are a number of management measures, particularly out on East Beach where they like to hang out regularly. And those include not being able to groom, I think it's 10 feet above the rack area, and do other disturbance measures in the area that they roost in regularly. And also that there can't be things like big temporary events in that small roosting area, and that we shouldn't set up the volleyball courts there, that that's not an ideal location for that. So
So of course, if you went the other direction and designated it an ESHA and closed down a section of the beach, that would encourage more nesting, right? It's kind of like it's a chicken and an egg thing, right? The current status on the ground is it's not a current nesting area. They pass through there, but it's not nesting, and there's lots of people sharing the area too. It could be a nesting area if no people were there, but we're past that time, right, in life.
that's not necessarily true. That's something that would have to be studied. That nesting for western snowy plover really takes certain conditions. It takes a back dune area and certain activity levels. They don't like to be where it's super crowded and things like that. And East Beach really doesn't exist without significant sediment management by the city every year. It wouldn't look like it does now with
Okay.
that. So it's not clear that if we just let it alone, if it actually would be snowy plover and nesting habitat. That is something that would have to be studied.
Okay,
further.
and that's clearly not a requirement to do, right? To study whether returning something to a less used state would increase nesting capability.
It's not a requirement.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Jordan. Just to add to that, I just want a clarification on a question that Commissioner Jordan asked. The cutoff period for responses to public comment for this Planning Commission meeting was June 18th, according to, I think, what Ms. Brooks said. And so this letter that we received was dated the 20th and came in actually today, the 21st. Is there another public comment period between the Planning Commission meeting and the City Council meeting in August? I assume that there is, where this would be addressed.
Madam Chair, thank you for asking that question. So we didn't have a specific quote-unquote public comment period. We chose June 18th as the date that we needed to more or less, we couldn't realistically respond to any comment letters received after that in our addendum, but we could try to respond to any comment letters that came in since then here at the hearing today. It just so happens we've only received one comment letter, and it was today. We do have a caveat in our public notice that if materials received very late prior up to the council or the commission meeting, the commissioners may not have time to consider it. But we will continue to receive public comment on this document leading up to the City Council hearing. Again, there won't be a defined period of time. We can, even if we release a staff report or release another version of this document based on revisions today or any other revisions based on the addenda, we can still continue to receive public comment, and to the extent we can address those prior to City Council, again, up to a reasonable point, where then at that point we would just be attaching public comment to the City Council staff report, and they consider that perhaps without staff's written response.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I hope that helps a little bit.
Sure.
Okay, I think Commissioner Schwartz was next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a few starter questions. I may have more later. Mr. Vincent, one more question on the Dahl & Associates letter. There's a reference in the third paragraph asserting that 15 calendar days simply constitute an inadequate amount of time, et cetera. And I'm just wondering, is there any legal issue with this assertion, or?
No.
No. Okay, thank you. Then I can set that aside. In Mr. Moldaver's comments, it triggered a question for me about Fish and Wildlife and maybe any other governmental entities. Do we need, following Planning Commission and or City Council approval of our plan, to forward the plan first to other governmental agencies before it gets sent to the Coastal Commission? Or are we good to go at that point in just sending it to the Commission?
Right. Madam Chair and Commissioner Schwartz, no, we are not obligated to send it to any other agencies prior to submitting for an LCP amendment. We do notify particular agencies that may have an interest in this, though. So they're made aware that we're going through this process and that we're having these hearings. So they are and can comment on it if they want
which
to.
they have, and you've already been discussing that, okay. So on the snowy plover issue, are you satisfied with our communication with Fish and Wildlife and what I would call agreement or, I guess closure in essence?
Yes,
Hedrick?
we discussed with them what we proposed, and they seemed fine with it.
Okay.
And we also, I believe, spoke with Environmental Defense Center, and they were okay with the language.
They're satisfied as well? Okay, very good. Let's see, then I think I have a couple questions maybe from the staff report addendum, what I'll call number 1, which is dated June 18th. On page 2 of this addendum, remind me if you would, this is policy 5.1-33A. So on page 2, this is the first paragraph. A definition for substantial, as in substantial development. I don't know if this is to you or Mr. Vincent. Is that codified in the Coastal Act or elsewhere in our document, just so that everybody's clear about what constitutes substantial versus minor, which is also used in our documentation?
Madam Chair, Commissioner Schwartz, in Section 2.1, there's a policy that defines substantial redevelopment.
Okay.
And then an associated policy that deals with what happens when you have substantial redevelopment of nonconforming structures.
Yes, right.
That definition is specific to this document.
Okay.
The California Code of Regulations does not have a specific definition called substantial redevelopment.
Well, that's what I was recalling. That's why I wanted to make sure that, going forward, I think to the extent that applicants in particular are as clear as can be in terms of understanding what constitutes substantial versus minor or non-substantial is very, very important. I think there's been some confusion for a number of years about that, so that's helpful. And then then the second paragraph, which is identified as B, so same policy B on page 2, I was trying to recall, and I apologize, I didn't have time to do this research myself. The Coastal Commission has had some evolving policies around shoreline protective devices. Could you just remind me or remind us where we are with that in terms of how we'll treat potential applicant proposals or requests for shoreline protective devices now?
Sure, Commissioner Schwartz. We are actually rather aligned with Coastal Commission staff in this document on shoreline protection structures. They're basically only allowed for to protect existing principal structures.
Only principal? That's the important kind of
Yes.
caveat there, principal structures?
And for use in protection of public beaches and coastal dependent uses such as the harbor or public access stairways. And there's a number of requirements as to a number of measures that have to be taken if you want to try to get them approved. The one area of disagreement with California Coastal Commission staff is as to the definition of existing. So, according to the Coastal Act,
that was going to be my next question. Thank you.
The Coastal Act says that shoreline protection devices are allowed for existing structures, and it just says that. It doesn't say anything about when existing is or which structures or anything like that. And so it had been the Coastal Commission's position, even legally, up until very recently, that existing meant at the time that now, at the time that we're reviewing a permit, if a structure exists. But recently, staff at least has changed course on that and believe that it's existing is as of 1977. So that means that anything built after 1977 would not be allowed to have a shoreline protection device. So that is one area of disagreement, that putting that into our LCP without having a legislative change to the Coastal Act done would raise a lot of legal concerns and other issues for the city, given that we've been issuing permits since 1977 with a different assumption. But I would note that this document does make it clear that anything built from this point forward, as of the date of certification of this document, is not considered existing. So anything new that's built after certification of this document should not be considered existing in the future for the purposes of getting a shoreline protection device. And there are also conditions placed on new structures with policies in this document that would prohibit future use of a shoreline protection device.
I think I may have missed something. What's the difference between 1977 and when we get our program or plan recertified? I guess I didn't understand. Why isn't 77 just forward in perpetuity? No, I see. Oh, is this true? Okay, let me back up. Excuse me. So from 1977, let's just say 1977 to when we get our plan recertified, that would be existing. That would constitute existing. But then from the certification forward, there's an absolute prohibition.
Yes.
And it would not be considered existing.
So right now in this document, we just go on record that anything from certification of this forward is definitely not existing.
Correct.
As part of our negotiations with Coastal Commission, we haven't commented on before then.
We have not. The city has not commented yet on how we will treat or define 1977 to whenever they recertify or newly certify. So how are we going to deal with that? That we've not resolved that, we've not come to an agreement on that.
The Coastal Commission's in the process right now of reviewing what's called the residential guidelines for, I forgot the exact name, sea level rise adaptation. Right. And this issue is front and center in that document. They have not acted on that document yet, but it is the number one controversial issue associated with that document. So they are real likely to see what happens with that before our item actually goes to hearing. So I think that's part of Coastal Commission staff are waiting to see what happens on that. It might also not get decided until we submit our zoning code to them when we really get down to details about this. That's what they've done with other agencies. They actually have not required this on an LCP yet. On the one that they tried to, they ended up punting it to the implementation plan phase because they couldn't decide.
And so when you say not required this, we're referring to this pretty significant issue of defining existing, and if it's 1977 to whatever the date is when an LCP gets submitted for recertification, and this is going on with a number of coastal communities. So it just seems to me like this is a huge issue hanging out there. Would you agree?
Yes. Yes. But I would say that the city's practice right now, because we incorporate by reference right now in our LUP all the Coastal Act sections. So this Coastal Act section we use to issue coastal development permits right now. And our interpretation of the Coastal Act section for issuing those permits right now is that existing is right now, is the date of permit action, not 1977.
So whenever that permit was issued, so it's on in a sense, a rolling basis, whatever the date is that a CDP was issued from that point forward. So it's case by case in that sense, right? If we're using that kind of definition.
And it's dependent too on whether or not the approval for the structure that was given had conditions on it that they couldn't get a shoreline protection in the future. So that's one caveat.
Sort of uniquely conditioned to prohibit that.
Yeah, because recently we have put those conditions on.
Yes, okay.
So I think we would continue that practice until we hear otherwise from you all or from...
Seems to be, I don't know, if we're gonna, a large one to tackle. I don't know if you want the discussion to happen today. I'll move on from that, although I think that's a significant discussion and policy making decision. So regarding the Coastal Commission, and you know that I was going to ask you to speak to this today, could you or Ms. Brooke give us an update on where we are with the most recent, what I'll call kind of the newer list of policy, is there policy disagreement or lack of resolution? And I don't know that this has been aired in front of the public, in front of the Planning Commission yet since our last hearing. Could you just review that list with us? And if there's reference to those within our document, maybe go slowly and tell us where we can find that in the newly prepared documents. I think Ms. Hetrick is very familiar with what I'm referring to.
So very familiar. Madam Chair, Commissioner Schwartz, let's see, where did we leave off last? So I think right before the March 1st hearing, we had not heard from Coastal Commission about very specific comments in a while. They had said that they might have some issues, but they weren't saying what, and they gave us a long list of policies that they might have issue with, but not what the issues were. So I think that's the list you're referring to.
Sort of by categories, but not then getting down into
Yes.
what are the concerns regarding these categories or
Right.
these policies, yes.
So we subsequently met with them and through discussion worked out a lot of those issues, like either they still didn't have the issue after the conversation, or there were easy changes that we could do. And then in May, they submitted written comments on the hazard section and then I think the public access parking policies that were very detailed. And so we met with them to discuss those policies, and that's why you see a lot of edits to those in here. And actually, we did resolve the parking issues that they have, and so that was one of our outstanding issues before that was significant that as of right now is resolved. We'll see what happens in the future. So our list of remaining areas of disagreement are really the same list we've had for a while. It's actually shorter now because we've worked out some issues in the last few months, but do you want me to go through those?
No, I just wanted to get a sense of, because we really haven't talked publicly about if there are new items or expanded items. We got down to a short list. We all know about that because we took those up in the prior hearing. But then there's been this expansion and continued back and forth, which you've now just described. So I just wanted to make sure for today's purposes, if there are new issues or revisited issues that are now have been reopened as concerns, that it may be appropriate for us to talk about or to just have on record as to a status. It's just, I'll just look to you to comment on that.
I think most of them we've discussed before, except for one that is kind of new. Hold on, let me.
I don't know if you have a slide on that or.
I'm not sure. Oh, yeah, this is it. So the last one, it's a new thing that coastal staff does not want us to allow slope protection to protect existing garages or secondary dwelling units. Now, it's important to note the difference between shoreline protection device, which is a protection device that is either protecting against or influenced by marine influences and storm waves. Slope protection is really, it can be anywhere. It can be way inland. It's retaining walls, soldier piles, that kind of thing. And basically this would make slope protection not allowed in the same cases that shoreline protection is not allowed. And city staff do not agree that they have the same level of coastal impacts, slope protection and shoreline protection. Shoreline protection affects sand supplies and all kinds of coastal processes. Slope protection can have visual impacts and that kind of thing, but is not quite at the same level as shoreline protection. And so it is our recommendation that it would be allowed for existing garages or secondary dwelling units, and that's just balancing landowner concerns with coastal concerns. And there's not a coastal act section addressing slope protection.
Right.
So that's the one issue I think we haven't discussed before. But the others we have, and if you have any questions on them, I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't have any question on that one. Okay, very good. Let me just see if I have any others from. On page 3, then, of this same amendment that we're looking at, this is in small number 4, Roman numeral number 4, on page 3. I wanted to ask you about the 20 years. Maybe this is just a memory jogger for me. Limit the approval of the minor improvements to a maximum 20 years from the issuance of the coastal development permit. And I know the commission's been in discussion among themselves for some time about time constraining, shall I say, CDPs. So bring me up to date, the 20 years. Maybe this was in a previous iteration. I don't know. Is this their new kind of firm time horizon for minor improvements? Did this come out of our work?
There's no firm or set time horizon. I think the intent of the 20 years is that this minor, we really don't want anything in the coastal development buffers. That would, in general, just because eventually those areas are going to be prone to slip failure eventually. We are suggesting that minor developments such as patios and safety lighting and safety fences be allowed with the conditions that once erosion meets those minor developments that they are removed, because we basically don't want to see that stuff down on the beach and on the bluff faces. And so the intent behind the maximum 20 years is just a check-in point that most of that kind of development doesn't have a lifespan beyond that, and a check-in to make sure that, hey, is it still appropriate where it is? Is erosion coming up to it? That kind of thing.
Now, that triggered a general question about the Commission's policy guidance or positions on CDPs. I had been hearing a few years ago that they were talking about a firm 10 years on all CDPs, and I don't know if that even came up in discussion with you. Maybe that was just sort of urban legend, so to speak, casting a lot of fear into coastal communities that all CDPs would just have a set time limit of 10 years. Have you heard, do you know anything about that? Have you heard that?
I have not heard that. I have heard in relation to sea level rise, areas that are potentially going to be impacted severely by sea level rise, of putting limits on permits because of the extreme changes that might occur,
Maybe
but I haven't heard a
context.
specific number or a...
Okay. Let's see, that may be, I think that's it for now. I may have some questions later. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Schwartz. Commissioner Higgins, you were next.
Thank you. The part of the document that talks about AUD, and I don't have it in front of me, but you've included the word moderate housing in the definition, I think, to just sort of wrap around all the AUD potential. But isn't that moderate level sort of associated with an income level? Because we don't really have income levels specified in the AUD program now, you know, being a capital A or an income restricted mark. It does say workforce housing, and that's the intent, but is there any risk that if we put the word moderate in there now that it later becomes part of a program where there's income limits on AUD projects?
Chair Wiscombe and Commissioner Higgins, that's a good question. So currently in the general plan, there are references in different sections in the land use element and the housing element as to how the AUD program, what sort of households should be targeted more or less for the AUD program. And it talks about middle and upper middle income. It references workforce housing. It doesn't reference moderate income currently in the general plan. But we do know going forward, at least, City Council has initiated ordinance amendments to the AUD program to have an inclusionary housing component that would require a developer to set aside some portion of the units or an in lieu fee for moderate income. Now, granted, that ordinance hasn't been developed or adopted by City Council, but with that intent, we were comfortable putting it in this policy currently in the LCP, and should we amend the general plan in the future with respect to the AUD program, we might then go back and put that as an income level that the AUD program would also provide housing for.
So then it is intended to potentially be an income category description in this document.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, so another subject with respect to noticing. There, in my understanding of the iterative process beyond the March hearing here is that there's been, and we've got it outlined here, the track changes format. There's been changes to the document, generally becoming more restrictive for property owners in certain zones in the coastal zone, right, with regard to substantial redevelopment or shoreline protection. There's changes here. I wouldn't use the word substantial, but there are changes to the coastal land use plan from March to now, and there was some agency noticing, but there wasn't necessarily noticing or postcards that went out to property owners. And there was a slide that said seemed to intimate that there was notice to property owners, but was there a separate new notice to property owners about these changes?
Right. Commissioner Higgins, the reference to notice to property owners that I covered in the presentation were to those property owners where we were proposing a change to the land use designation for the property they owned. Because the policies of the LCP could potentially affect the intensity or of use of land throughout the coastal zone, we did a display ad in order to, leading up to this hearing and making the public aware of the review draft materials as well as the hearing. So we did not do individual mail noticing to every owner in the coastal zone, letting them know that this document was available, but we did have a display ad and notified anybody who had previously indicated interest in wanting to know when the document was available.
How about those in the hazard zones or hazard areas, Sea Ledge Lane?
Sorry, Commissioner Higgins and members of the commission, there was prior notice to property owners who were in the either the creek buffer areas or the hazard areas. That was done in advance of the...
I think that was November, right?
Yeah, for the public outreach in November. We did not do a second mailing targeted just to those owners for this release.
But I understood your comment about the notice going to parcels with a mapped change. That includes those that... There was a reference somewhere in one of maybe the addendum about picking up a couple of properties in the Eucalyptus Hill area where the boundary actually changed, and those people were noticed. Those parcels were specifically sent notices to. Okay.
Yes, they were.
Okay, a couple more questions. Policy 2.1-11 on page 15. What is water-oriented recreation? So these look like new policies that were added at the top of the page. 2.1-11.
Commissioner Higgins, this is one of several policies that were added that are directly repeating the coastal access and recreation policies of the Coastal Act. And I think I explained before that the city is required to have a public access component to its LCP. And then separately, we could get really into it, but in certain situations, we have to make findings on the Coastal Act sections of the public access and recreation Coastal Act sections. And instead of having to figure that out every time, we were only missing a few of those policies being repeated as LCP policy. So we just threw in the rest so we don't have to make separate findings.
Got it. Okay.
later.
Moving on to parking at policy 3.1-30. I'm sorry, page 26. So this relates to on-street parking, correct? And off-street lots?
Yes, this relates to on-street parking and public parking lots that have been designated as key public access parking areas.
And these are the areas there's a map in here
Yes.
somewhere that's got the little lines on some of the streets next to the some of
Yes.
the stairways, right? So I just am curious about why the ADA language was removed, and then I have a question about why significant is used instead of substantial. And my question is, if it looks like if we're using significant adverse impact, we're having to use CEQA CEQA analysis to determine that rather than a substantial. Is that what's happening here? No, or what's the difference?
Not in my mind, but this was a request of Coastal Commission. We actually didn't think it had a significant difference, but it was a request of theirs. And then as far as the ADA and nuisance language that was at the beginning here, that was just moved. Well, first of all, the nuisance is covered in a policy in section 1.2. Anything that's a declared nuisance does not require coastal review anyways. And Scott can get into that if you have more questions, but the language about driveway access and ADA was actually moved into policy 3.1-36, which is when you have to do an evaluation of potential impacts to key public access parking areas. And this was a request of the Coastal Commission.
Could you repeat that?
So this policy 3.1-36 outlines when you have to do a detailed evaluation of potential impacts to public access as a result of changes in a key public access parking area. So if you are below the thresholds here, there's an assumption that there is not an impact.
And what's the threshold?
The thresholds are outlined in subsections 1 through 4. And
where's that?
On pages 28 and 29. So all this is saying when an evaluation needs to happen. If you exceed these thresholds and you do an evaluation and it turns out you don't have impacts to public access, then you can still get an approval. But this is just saying you need to do a study or look at it closely.
So, right, so just to sequin or, the word significant and parking, removing parking was removed from CEQA, right, as an impact. So, but we're walking that back in the coastal zone, I guess, right? And so how do you go about, so if you're not removing more than 10% of on-street parking, you're going to count, I'm mostly concerned with neighborhoods and the on-street parking, not the lots. But if something happens in one of those areas, and you're going to have to go out and count the right-of-way availability, and then if it's a quantitative analysis of how many spaces are removed, right? That's the procedure.
Madam Chair and Commissioner Higgins,
Yeah.
the staff and my approach to the Coastal Commission staff's request to change the word substantial to significant is to reflect that they are synonyms. It may be an attempt by the Coastal Commission staff to conflate the issue and bring in CEQA-type analysis to these questions, but the way I see it, substantial or significant are synonyms for purposes of evaluating whether it's a big impact or not a big impact.
I understand. So, but then the rest of my question just pertains to the number of street parking spaces that are removed, and they have to be counted, and then that's a process that we do now for certain development projects, or we don't do that now, right? We don't count on-street parking as a part of a project, but now we will be, to determine if there's more than 10% removed.
Madam Chair and Commissioner Higgins, I'll jump in for a second, and staff can add in any of their thoughts. The point here is that the key public access parking is public parking. It's either on the right-of-way or it's a city lot. So any project that might affect these things is going to be a city project. Or it's going to be subject. You might see a driveway curb cut. I don't see a driveway curb cut if it's needed, if it needs to meet certain standards. I don't see that being substantial. However, if the city undertakes some kind of timed parking, residential permit parking, or if there some other kind of restriction of the on-street parking or changes physically to the off-street parking lots, this process that is being set up is that the first would be in anticipating that any lost parking would be somehow mitigated through other design elements, bringing in multimodal access, that kind of thing, to mitigate the impacts on the parking as it might affect access to the oceanfront. Otherwise, if that isn't incorporated into the project, then this evaluation that you're talking about must be undertaken, and then some other form of mitigation comes to bear.
Thank you for running down this rabbit hole with me. But you have some homes in the Mesa, and I haven't looked at these, driven by these areas that are identified here, but some of them are just single-loaded driveways, and I could see a situation where somebody's got to go from a single shooter to a double-loaded garage, and that does theoretically increase the driveway width. And so that's just a mini concern of mine about how that looks in the future. And I think to your point about timed parking or restrictions on parking, residential permit parking programs, I don't think that's allowable in these particular areas. That was my read here. Is that correct? In these areas, those areas would not be appropriate or approvable for residential permit parking.
That's not necessarily true. Again, you would just have to do an evaluation of the impacts to the public access to the shoreline. Yeah.
Okay, so last question. How do we arrive at the 1,200 square foot allowance for the single-family homes or the principal structures? Is that a case here that we're...
No, so that really is just relating back to state requirements on accessory dwelling units. But really, it shouldn't get used that often, because in both the buffer reduction policies where that is outlined, the 1,200 square feet, when you're rebuilding, you're allowed to have either the existing square footage or 1,200 square feet, whichever is bigger. And at some point, Tim, you could speak to, there are very few parcels there right now that are less than 1,200 square feet in development. And so it shouldn't apply that many times.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Higgins. Commissioner Thompson?
To follow up on Commissioner Schwartz's question before, let's assume that this list that you had up here that the Coastal Commission staff doesn't agree with the city's position on. We go forward, City Council adopts this plan as currently written, and it goes to the Coastal Commission staff, and they use the pressure that they're not going to certify it unless you change to reflect their position in there. What's the implications, and do you just make the changes in the plan and then notify us that it's a fait accompli, or do we have to go back through a noticing and a hearing process again, or how do we close the loop on this issue about the disagreement with the Coastal Commission staff, which seems to be a never-ending disagreement?
And you want to
Madam Chair and Commissioner Thompson, I'll start off by saying our goal is to submit an LCP amendment to the Coastal Commission that they could certify without modifications. But that's a pretty optimistic goal. We are narrowing down our issues where we have disagreement with the staff, at least. And we've been upfront about where we continue to have remaining disagreements. We want the Planning Commission to be aware of those. We'll continue to carry those forward to City Council should we have any other or remaining areas of disagreement. Because ultimately, if City Council does approve this document and recommend and allow staff to apply to the Coastal Commission for an LCP amendment, we want all the decision makers to know that we are doing that, knowing that they may not certify it as it's approved locally. And so you make that decision knowing that at least. And then we would, if the Coastal Commission continues to have changes they want to recommend, or the Coastal Commission themselves actually require modifications in order to certify the document, we would go to that hearing and make our best argument why we believe locally that the amendment that we've submitted is appropriate for our community. And then we'll see what happens. You can get into a back and forth with the Coastal Commission and the local agency and try to winnow down the areas of disagreement. We hope not to have to do that, but it's pretty rare. I think that a major LCP amendment like this would go through certification without some modifications from the Commission.
Yeah, I understand that, but I'm assuming that they have the hammer and they're not going to certify it unless they're in agreement with that they are seeing what they want to see. So let's assume that they don't like the way it's written in those areas and they require it to be changed. Do we have to go back through any kind of a noticing process, or do you just notify us that it's a fait accompli, the Coastal Commission has decreed it, so therefore it is so?
So my understanding is that if they approve it with suggested modifications, it comes back through the city's process to either accept the document as modified, or to present an alternate LCP amendment to them. We don't like your modifications, we're sending this back to you. So I think it depends on that process, but I would imagine they would be notified hearings just like we've been notifying them. I would also just note that the remaining areas of disagreement are with staff. They give us recommendations a lot of times, recommendations that might not necessarily be things that they are willing to make findings on in their staff report as suggested modifications. So it is not a guarantee that these areas of remaining disagreement are actually definitely going to be suggested modifications. Something might not happen in their policy at the state level, or, we have not heard from them that these are for sure suggested modifications. It's more that they are their recommendations, and yeah.
Well, you give me great hope that we might be going around this loop again. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Thompson. Commissioner Lodge.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Relatively minor thing in the June 18th second addendum on page 2, relating to minor improvements in the backyard where there's a limited amount of room. We had a couple of letters from people who live on Shoreline indicating that they would like to be able to build a trellis or a pergola. Even with these changes, they still would not be allowed to do that, but they could have a patio no more than 10 inches high and a fence no more than 42 inches high. But they couldn't have a shade structure.
Yes, Commissioner Lodge. They'd be limited to patios no taller than 10 inches high, fencing, lighting. Did I miss something? Landscaping, walkways, not bigger shade structures or pergolas.
I don't disagree with that policy. I just wanted to make sure I read it correctly. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. I have a few questions before we go back again. Okay. So I went over a lot of my comments and questions with Ms. Hetrick earlier, but I just want to review a couple things. Page 4.1 4.3-20, which is policy 4.3-28. I'll have to get to it. I'm sorry. 4.3. Okay. Oh, it's the close to the last one here. Okay. We're defining here a view corridor, and after a discussion with Ms. Hetrick on this, it's different. My interpretation, I asked that the word narrow be taken out, but what I've learned, and from a conversation that probably isn't clear in this document, is that where's the view map? That's here somewhere. Is that close to the beginning of this section? Here it is. The what you call the visual cone views is different than the view corridor. So, Ms. Hetrick, I just wanted you to go over that a little bit, because if the word narrow remains, and my argument was a view corridor isn't necessarily narrow, but this was defining something else, that I think it should be clearly distinguished from the view cones, which are on the map. Are you following me? Yeah.
Madam Chair, my understanding of the view corridor definition and then the associated development review policy, which is 4.3-6, is that this was really intended to address those remaining view corridors in our urban core, where you have two buildings and you have a limited view. It's not a panoramic view. You're not up on the Riviera seeing the ocean. You see through a narrower corridor views of the mountains or views of the ocean, et cetera, for instance, on State Street and other places. And that was the intent of defining view corridor, as opposed to the cone views are all kinds of different types of views. So panoramic, all different types.
So can we make the distinction somewhere in this document so people are clear that there's view cones and there's view corridors? The view corridors aren't defined. The view cones are on the map. So I'm just wondering if we could make that distinction somewhere in the document so that people are clear that in addition to the view cones on the map, there are view corridors that exist in the city that we don't want obstructed, that are not listed here.
Madam Chair, just so I'm clear on your question, so view corridor is defined in policy 4.3-28. Are you asking that we try to map what is a view corridor?
No, absolutely
okay,
not.
Thank you.
No.
Because there would be many. Okay,
no,
so maybe
no.
I
What
need
I'm
help
saying is that on figure 4.3.1, scenic resources, you show view cones. And when I asked you to take out the word narrow, I thought you were referring to the view cones. I've since learned from Ms. Hetrick that you're referring to something entirely different that is not listed, but that exists. So I'm just asking you to please make that distinction in this document that you're referring to something other than the view cones. So that's okay. Because that wasn't clear when I read it as a layperson. Okay, and then then I'd like to just talk a little bit about, I'm in the section 5 now, 5.1. Let's go to policy 5.1-19, which is on page 33. Okay, and this is a new policy. Adaptation and development. New development and substantial redevelopment shall consider the expected life of the proposed development climate change, particularly sea level rise. No, that's not what I wanted. I'm looking for the ones that talk about looking for the ones that talk about the best available information.
Madam Chair, I believe that's page
Oh, it is here.
33.
Yeah. Yeah, it is here. It's actually in a couple of different places, the best available information. So I think it's important to clarify who's determining what the best available information is, because you're going to get conflicting scientific opinions. We get them on the top of Bluff all the time, and we're going to get them on climate change. And you know, there's going to be conflicting scientific evidence. So I don't know how that is accomplished, but I think that just saying the best available information is very subjective, whose information it is. So who's determining what the best available information is? And I don't have an answer for that. I'm throwing that out there because I think it really needs to be addressed to be clear. Is it the best available information is determined by staff? The best available information as accepted by the city of Santa Barbara, or
Madam Chair.
This is like the hot potato.
No.
You're all looking at each other.
I think it's like any other standard that's in these policies. The end interpretation for any given phrase in here is really up to the decision makers at the city, and we can give our staff recommendation. And so to us, putting as decided by the city is kind of repeating what's actually true of every policy, and might actually give an implication that in other areas it's not decided by the city. We are issuing these permits. They're appealable to the Coastal Commission, so they have input, but really we are deciding what all the language in these policies mean on a project-by-project basis.
Okay. I will accept that. That's fine. And then okay, and I just want to look at one more, page 5.1-68. That's the page number. I'm not sure I have a question, but no, we talked about that. That's the 20 horizontal feet. So I didn't read the word horizontal when I first read it, and I thought 20 feet away is, maybe just for the commission, you could clarify how you arrived at the 20 horizontal feet, and I think probably Mr. Bolton can do that. That's...
Chair Wiscombe, the 20 feet arrived from adding some flexibility within this, and to acknowledge that there is there is the potential for there to be error in the underlying LiDAR and information that fed into the development of the Bluff Edge line. That being said, that line is developed using extremely high resolution and a really highly accurate database, so we're fairly confident in the location of the topographic features, and then the Coastal Commission mapping unit using that information to interpret where the bluff edge is. But we also want to acknowledge that things do change over time. The bluff might erode some, and so there's flexibility on a minor scale to acknowledge that. But it still gets away from some of the issues we've historically had where there's a disagreement in step-like features and the arguments that the bluff edge is 400 feet horizontally from where the Coastal Commission has interpreted it to be.
Right. So, and the 20 horizontal feet in most cases will be significantly less in contour definition. So, because of the steepness of our slopes, right? That's what I'm interpreting.
Yes, Madam Chair. So 20 horizontal feet is, as it sounds, right. 20 horizontal feet, where a slope would go like this.
Right.
It's not 20 feet this way, it's 20 feet this way. So actually that can equal a slope distance that's a lot less.
So most of the scientific disputes that we get in terms of top of bluff here, which we've seen a lot of, are more than 20 horizontal feet.
Yes,
Yes,
definitely.
yeah.
And it's 20 horizontal feet seaward of the mapped line.
Correct, yes.
Because
Yeah.
there are bluff failures and changed conditions that would move the line landward.
Landward, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I think that takes care of all my questions. Thank you for that. I think Commissioner Schwartz had some more?
Thank you. Two areas of questions here. One has just come to mind in hearing your questions, Madam Chair, especially in the coastal hazards section. And I apologize, I overlooked asking you this, but this has been on my mind for some time. This term, where extent feasible, to the extent feasible, analysis of the feasibility. You know, it's in a number of sections. I won't bother to try to cite everywhere where these terms exist, but I guess I'm looking for staff comment on the usefulness of this wide open language that it seems, from my experience, on a project by project, applicant by applicant basis, depending upon, you know, the professionals that are hired, both by the city and the applicant, to render professional opinions on a wide variety of coastal hazard or environmental conditions, hazards, feasibility. We end up trying to navigate the differing professional views, and it seems to always come down to, you know, a highly subjective, highly qualitative decision. And so I don't know if you have any comments for me, but it seems like we continue to set these very wide goalposts. You know, in some case, I'm very supportive of flexibility in policy making and so forth, and I've spoken to that before. But here, I don't know why we're saying to the extent feasible or analysis of feasibility when it's just so open. I don't know if you've had these discussions with Coastal Commission staff, but anything you could comment on would be appreciated by me.
Commissioner Schwartz, I think it depends on which extent feasible we're talking about. In general, I think in the hazard section especially, it's in places where we know that it's not feasible in some situations, but we want to try to achieve less risk in that area, or to achieve minimizing risk in a certain way. Or a lot of times Coastal Commission staff wanted that, and so they want it at least tried, but acknowledging that there's parcels out there that it would be a takings to absolutely say. So an example that has come up is that Coastal Commission staff wanted a finding that all new development be located outside the flood area. So if you know, if you've ever seen the flood map in the city of Santa Barbara, you know that it encompasses
hazard
like
maps
a massive part of our downtown and coastal zone.
Yes, right.
And so that's not feasible. But ideally, if you had a big parcel where there was only the flood zone on one part of it, you would want to locate the building outside of the flood zone. So this is their way of saying, hey, if you have an ability, you should be doing that, because that's the best thing.
Kind of try your best. Try your best.
We are recognizing that that it's not feasible on parcels, but we at least want you to try.
All right, we'll have to continue to wrestle with that. Okay, and then I want to go back, and I apologize for overlooking this, but Commissioner Higgins brought it up on page 11 of the staff report. It pertains to the average unit size density incentive program. So it's clarifying policy 2.1-3. Number one, I'm concerned about us, I don't know if this is a clarification or an addition to our plan. This is in the staff report, page 11. The second bullet down under chapter 2.1. I guess what jumped out at me first there, and my question to you is, why would we include, maybe you're going to just tell me it's really just a refinement or clarification, based on one community organization's letter that we're including this term moderate income? That's one of my questions. But number two, in a larger question, and I apologize if you Phil, you already answered this with Commissioner Higgins' questions. But since we have not yet taken up the amendments or any amendments to the AUD program, it seems to me it's premature to qualify this in any way. We're going to begin that in fourth quarter. It's going to go into first quarter of next year. We'll have many hours of many discussions. So why are we looking to say much of anything about this program other than exactly what exists in the ordinance today? Could you either educate me or help me understand this?
Commissioner Schwartz, I don't disagree with you. As I mentioned earlier in response to Commissioner Higgins' question, you're correct. In the general plan, there is not a mention of the AUD program targeting moderate income households. And we suggested this revision. I don't feel strongly one way or the other if it remains. If the Planning Commission disagrees, I don't think there's any harm in removing the reference to moderate income categories here in this policy. We ultimately put it in because of City Council's initiation of a to-be-determined inclusionary housing program that would target moderate income households for AUD projects going forward. So it was in recognition of that action by City Council. But I would leave it to your commission if you want to have that reference to moderate remain or not.
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Mr. Vinson.
I agree with Ms. Brooks' analysis as to why the language has been added. I would actually be a little more firm in recommending that the Commission allow it to remain. I read this policy as merely it's a policy that ultimately the City Council will implement. It'll choose how to implement the policy. And as far as the income categories that may or may not be included in the housing incentive measures or the implementation measures that the council will ultimately land on, that's going to be the decision, the discretionary decision, legislative decision of the City Council. By adding the word moderate here, at least in that sense, it takes away a potential argument that to do so, to actually incorporate provisions to incentivize or to promote the development of moderate income housing units as part of the AUD, that it's somehow not consistent with, in this case, the Coastal Act or the city's LCP policies. I would be recommending the same revision if the council was to go forward with an inclusionary program associated with rental housing, that those kinds of amendments would occur in the general plan to acknowledge that it's consistent with the general plan, as opposed to, in its absence, it's possible that someone or some group might suggest, well, your general plan doesn't mention moderate income housing, you shouldn't be doing that. Whereas we have many other policies within the general plan that say we're promoting all sorts of types of housing of every income category. So,
well, Mr. Vinson, if I could just kind of take this a step further or press you a bit further. If we were to look at the list of suggested potential future changes to the AUD program, the ordinance, that came out of the most recent City Council hearing that the Planning Commission will take up starting fourth quarter of this year, it certainly goes beyond this. There's parking, there's the map, there's, it's a fairly long list. So my concern, so now I'm sorry, Madam Chair, but I'm going to just comment if I could, because I'm uncomfortable with this. First of all, it's anticipatory. That makes me uncomfortable. We've not changed a policy and an ordinance. And this is one of a number of areas of the program in the ordinance that were just suggested changes by the council. And I think I'm concerned that it's premature to put that in a new LCP before, like the cart before the horse. So I'll be interested to see if my colleagues have any further comments about that. But but I'm uncomfortable with it in the way it is. Quite frankly, the rest of the plan I think is terrific, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Schwartz. Commissioner Lodge?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Given that the goal of the AUD high priority, high density program, the test program, was to provide housing, workforce housing, moderate to middle income housing, I have no problem with having this in here. That was the goal. It hasn't turned out that way, and that's why Council is looking at making some changes. But it seems to me quite appropriate to have this in here. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Commissioner Jordan.
I'm transitioning to comments, okay? Just telling you. That's apparently we've gone that way. Yeah. So just keep moving along. So first I'd like to commend staff on doing a great job. Not only I think have you put up with or struggled with or challenged with more than we know with going back and forth with the Coastal Commission. I'm sure, like with me, you've also valiantly worked through questions and concerns and comments back and forth with each of us, and I think you guys have done a really good job. I'm sorry Deborah's not here today. Maybe she's not, so, but she should be part of that recognition. I think the general public reaction to this type of document is not always favorable because it adversely affects a horizontal slice of this community, and I think as Commissioner Higgins was alluding to, it maybe takes away some of their perceived rights or perceived wants. And I think we have to, this document helps support that we have to remember where we live and what we get for living here. There's no more obvious point to that to me visually than when you are going down Shoreline Drive and you hit the crest at the top of at the east end of Shoreline Park, and you hit the hill and then you drive the next several miles with practically zero development between the roadway and the ocean. And Ms. Lodge has talked about that for as long as I've known her and can tell you the history, but that makes us a very unique city with very unique and blessed characteristics. And I think that even when you live in this zone, as two of us sitting next to each other do, we're the only two on the commission, that comes with the territory to continue that blessing or curse, whatever it may be. As you guys know, when we talked about parking, I'm at ground zero for both Douglas Family Preserve and the Mesa Steps. And I've shared with you that I think that comes with the territory. When the kids complain, I said we could go to Bakersfield, and that's not a good alternative. So it kind of comes with the territory. But I think we have a responsibility to keep, not only maintain what's been given us, but to continually improve it. What's in today's buffer will be tomorrow's bluff top, and I think some people just don't recognize that, but it seems pretty obvious to me. Everything that's in this area deserves additional scrutiny. When it hits here, or when it hits council, or it hits another body, there may be disagreement on what the final outcome of that additional scrutiny is, but it certainly deserves the attention that the additional scrutiny gives it because of that heritage we have. The only kind of global complaint I would have is just a complaint of ignorance probably, but I kind of just wish when you have documents like this that we would find a way to lessen the impact on agreed areas that don't seem to have an impact. And it's hard to find an example this year because all our CDPs of late have been right on top of the bluff. But I would hazard it to like a modification for an existing same-size window in a non-conforming setback, and that needs a modification. But I would kind of go back to, these minor improvements in buffer zones, what we would call normal repair and maintenance in buffer zones. If they could not be lumped into this group, but somehow find a way to be done across the counter in a non-appealable area with adequate review. It just seems like, and then as you geographically get further away from the horizontal bluff, you're in some cases, I don't know, quarter mile, half mile away. It just kind of seems sillier and sillier by that time to put people through that. But again, my overarching kind of opinion on that is it comes with the territory. So I would fall back on that opinion from a global standpoint. But I wish it wasn't so regulatory for minor issues, what I perceive as minor, which is not what somebody else would perceive as minor, and for areas that are furthest away from the bluff top. But overall, I have nothing to complain about. I think you guys have done a great job. I hope that we don't have to see this back again. Or I hope that it happens 3 years from now. So it's somebody else that has to see it back again. But I'm hopeful that you get through this, and I think it'll be a great tool to continue to honor the coastline of Santa Barbara. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Jordan. Commissioner Thompson?
Well, thank you. I had the honor of working with the city staff folks on this for several years on the subcommittee, and I want to congratulate them for doing an excellent job under headwind conditions. This thing's been in work for almost 5 years, and that might be a record, but if it isn't a record, it's close to it. But I don't think we should give all the credit for that 5 years to the city staff. I think the Coastal Commission staff deserves the large share of credit for that 5-year process with their interminable requests for rewrites and wordsmithing and extensive meetings. And then when things get close to being finished, change the staff, and our staff had to start all over again to re-educate the Coastal Commission staff. So in spite of all that, we've gotten to this point, and I think it's time this thing moved forward to the City Council, and at the appropriate time, I'd be glad to move that.
Thank you, Commissioner Thompson. Commissioner Higgins?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll echo everything that everybody said about staff work and headwind, and I don't envy your job and your interaction with coastal staff and moving goalposts, but the product that's here is sort of a reflection of all of that analysis and hard work, and it's a pretty beefy document, and it's as much as you've tried to make it readable as planners do, it's hard to understand what's happening in it. And I don't want to. I'm going to end up making a mountain out of a molehill on noticing, but I think to as colorfully as Commissioner Jordan substantiated what's here, I think could have been done in a way to people in the affected areas, not everybody in the coastal zone, but those people that are going to have an eye-opener when they want to walk into the building department and get some bad news because of their perception of their rights. And so a postcard, I just, and I said it last hearing, I don't think does this justice. It's really just a missed opportunity to educate those people that have in their mind a lot to lose with regard to existing unpermitted structures that are no longer going to be able to be used or modified without a horrendous procedure in front of them, I think. So, and I almost want to go to where Commissioner Schwartz was headed with regard to this word or this phrase, if feasible. Balance is always good, and you can't, just yank people's rights, but it almost gives people a false sense of hope. Like we've seen before here, where we allow people to come in with a competing geology study or technical analysis, and then it just doesn't go anywhere. So I have a hard time with that process. I think I'd be more comfortable if there was better notice with a postcard. You can't put the effect of this document into a postcard. So that's why nobody showed up or nobody wrote letters that received the postcard. So that's my trouble with this. I don't know what to do about the public comment letter that came in. I tried to get through it. It does seem to be lopsided in favor of the particular client that's the subject of the letter, but there's also a lot of other information in there, and so I'd rather see this continued. Again, I'm sorry, don't take it personally, please, because you guys are doing a great work out there, but it's the other side of the fence here with the property owners, the affected property owners that I don't think are aware of what's happening, and I'd rather see a little bit more time taken in that regard. So those are my comments. I'm sorry, one more. I do have a big problem with the word moderate that's been put in there for the AUD provisions. The success of the AUD project is based on the lack of limitations put on the program for income restrictions, and so I think that inherently, if we're going to attach income restrictions to this project, I'll just agree to disagree with Mr. Vincent's analysis about which way you look at the general plan language. We're going to hamper people's ability to see our ability to see projects, AUD projects in the coastal zone if that restriction is there. So I would agree with Commissioner Schwartz on that matter.
Thank you, Commissioner Higgins. Commissioner Lodge?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to add my compliments to staff. You've done an excellent job, and I know it's been tough going sometimes, but we're here and we have a fine document, and I'm ready to happily send it on to the City Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Commissioner Schwartz, you would comment?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. First, I just want to say, kind of bottom line, I'll be supporting to move this forward. However, I need to strongly comment on the issue I already made on page 11, chapter 2.1, regarding the average unit size density incentive program. And quite frankly, and I'm going to be very pointed about this, I can't imagine staff or this commission recommending this type of anticipatory but unrealized and uncodified change in such a substantial document to the Coastal Commission, where an ordinance has yet to be actually changed that would include this type of provision or this language. I could give a number of, a list of other types of policies and programs that may be amended in the next year. They haven't been, and I think we are out of step in incorporating any, whether it's desired or undesired, by any particular decision-making body or individual to incorporate that into an updated local coastal plan. Now, having said that, so that's my very direct and pointed comment about that. Let me say on a positive note, having been involved with the long-range planning staff since 2014, that I think this plan has come a long way, and I want to be very positive in my remarks. I think we started out with sort of a more technical and almost policy wonkish document that's very difficult for the layperson or the average member of the public to understand, and I think we've come a long way, and so I want to thank the long-range planning staff for hearing that and working so hard to accomplish that. In terms of notification, this is community or public notification, and as Commissioner Higgins has said, could we always do more and could we do it better? I think the answer is yes. Today's not the day to try to articulate what more or what else could be done. But let me also just say, by reflection, in my former life, I was in corporate telecommunications, and I was involved in area code splits in California. And let me tell you, no matter what we did to try to get the information out, including holding numerous public forums, there were always individuals or even organizations that said they never got word that we were going to conduct area code splits. So it's really difficult to get sufficient word out to everybody affected. And we just do our best, and I think we've done a good job again, but we could probably always do a little better. But I'm not going to be harsh about that today. I do want to comment on this communication or interaction that Ms. Hetrick and I had about the definition of existing development. This really, I think, is a plaguing issue. I mean, I think it's a concerning, persisting area of lack of clarity with the Coastal Commission. Anything built after 1977 they think is existing. We're not necessarily in agreement with that. To me, that's a big gap between 1977 and, let's say, 2018 forward. So I don't know how this is going to be resolved or when it is. I certainly would hope, I think Commissioner Thompson may have referenced this, that this how can I say this, that it doesn't get resolved prior to, if it doesn't get resolved prior to our submission of our LCP update, and then it's this one major looming item out there and we don't get certification and they punt it back to us and we have to restart this. So I'm just, I hope staff can kind of get your energy back up and revisit this with the Commission to see if between now and our submission date we can try to come to some negotiated agreement about that. My general comments about this is that while this LCP and the process and the Coastal Act, as flawed as the act may be, the Coastal Commission itself may be, whether it's the commissioners or the staff and the process, and there's certainly enough complaints to go around, I think it's important to step back, and I've been doing this in preparing for our hearings such as today's. We are so fortunate in California that we have laws in place, we have policies, we have public engagement processes in place to ensure, with all due respect to Florida, I'm just going to say that we don't end up looking like the southern coast of Florida, where you have large multi-story hotel development right up onto the beach, and it's all the way down the beach, and it's really not for the general public anymore. And that's what's happened in a number of states that have large coastal areas. So we should be appreciative on balance, and I am very appreciative on balance, that we have this. Hopefully it continues to be a work in progress. As cumbersome and as exhausting as it is, but on balance, and I think Commissioner Jordan referenced what we should cherish and what we sometimes take for granted. That's a result of this very imperfect, flawed set of laws and policies and processes. So with that, I want to commend staff, and except for that one issue on the average unit size density incentive program, which I've already clearly expressed myself on, I'm happy to move the remaining body of the plan to the City Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Schwartz. I echo the praise of staff from my fellow commissioners. Having been on the subcommittee, it's been a long road, and the document has come a long way, and it's really great. And as someone that has had development in their neighborhood and have to deal with our current LCP and our general plan, hazard section, housing element section, whatever sections of the general plan that we have, and try to tie all those documents together, it's here in a bow, and it's really nice to have it in one place, and very succinctly, in most cases, I think very succinctly spelled out. I agree with Commissioner Lodge. I don't have any problem with adding the word moderate. It's housing opportunities for moderate, middle, and upper middle income categories under that under policy 2.1-3. it's not a deal breaker for me. I think you're all to be commended for the back and forth that I know. You've had several staff changes at Coastal Commission, and hopefully we're on a road to more of a straight and narrow path now instead of the curvy one we were on before, where you were getting mixed vibes from the Coastal Commission staff. So I'm perfectly happy to support the document. I think it's important that our comments are detailed in our minutes of this particular meeting. And I think that Commissioner Thompson was ready to make a motion. So if you would like to do so, go ahead.
Well, I'll move that the Planning Commission recommend to the City Council adoption of the General Plan Amendment and the LCP Amendment as enumerated in the staff report.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Do we have any further discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nope.
Okay, opposed by Commissioner Higgins. So it carries 5-1. Thank you very much for everything. Okay, we're going to move on to our administrative agenda, which is item number 4. And the first thing that we have to do is confirmation of selection of 2 Planning Commissioner representatives from the local Coastal Plan Update Subcommittee for the Sea Level Rise Adaptation Plan Subcommittee. And during our...
Madam Chair, I would nominate Commissioner Schwartz and Commissioner Wiscombe.
Second.
Are you sure you're right?
You want to hear my resume?
Unless you want to listen to the biographical descriptions of Commissioner Jordan.
I want to listen to
and
Commissioner Jordan's resume first.
We're on record. We're on record now.
No.
Okay, we'll wait for Commissioner Lodge to return.
Don't leave us yet, Ms. Lodge. We have a nomination by Commissioner Thompson and a second by Commissioner Jordan for Commissioner Schwartz and myself to serve on the Sea Level Rise Adaptation Subcommittee.
Okay.
So we're ready to vote on that.
Okay.
Are you all set?
I'm all set.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Can we still hear your resume though, or?
No resumes today.
Okay. So that's taken care of, and now we're on to staff hearing officer liaison report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yesterday was more open yard modifications, ADUs, and 1 lot line adjustment.
Okay. Thank you very much. Other committee and liaison reports. Is anyone? Yes, Commissioner Thompson.
Well, unusual for the Single Family Design Board to have something that might be of interest for the Planning Commission, but they had an application they heard for the first time this week about converting a duplex to a single-family residence, which is going the backwards way that we normally see. And the homeowner alluded to the fact that he was doing that so that once it's a single-family residence, he can apply to get an ADU over the garage. Now, figure that one out on East Valerio Street. So anyway, I thought it was very interesting. They're struggling with it. It was just a concept review, so it'll be back several times before it's final. A lot of the neighborhood there, because it accesses, a lot of the neighbors access off an easement driveway, are not in favor of it because it will impact the turnaround at the end. So it's an interesting project for the Single Family Design Board going the opposite way. It's an R2 zone, but he wants to turn it into an R1 with an ADU on top.
And then they can't review the ADU.
No, they can't.
Yeah. Wow.
They can't even discuss it, according to the guidance that the city staff has given them.
Yeah. Interesting. Does anyone else have any reports? Anything? Okay, I think we are done with business, and we are now adjourned. Thank you, everybody.